So hopefully you learned a lot in this lecture series where we talked about the human chromosomes and inheritance patterns of a lot of these things. And as you can see, we've done a lot of progress in the last century in trying to understand the chromosomes and also the genes within the chromosome by using things like linkage mapping, cytogenic mapping, physical mapping, and now more recently in the 90s, we started using genome sequencing. We actually figured out the position of a lot of the genes within the human genome, including the genes for all the different types of transfer RNA, RNA, types such as ribosomal RNA, all the RNA polymerases, all the enzymes which do multiple cell jobs, and also all of these proteins which cause several different looks in your body, including proteins which are associated with disorders, genetic disorders. And we continue to study the human genome to try to map the entire thing and figure out exactly where the important genes are. And by figuring that out, the possibilities are limitless of what we can actually do with the genome. And so that's why it's very important to continue to study this. And this is actually the forend of genetics, as well as comparison among other people and among other species. So this has revolutionized biology in the last decades or so. And this is the direction in which biology is going right now. Now, remember that we have the idea of dominance, okay, is basically on the chemical reaction that happens specifically in the genes. So there are some traits which we call dominant and other traits that we call recessive. But remember that dominance does not necessarily mean beneficial or more common. And that beneficial means something that's actually adapted to the environment. And common is going to be something that's beneficial. So dominance sometimes is not beneficial. And we talked about that when we talk about some of those dominant disorders that are actually rare. In most cases it causes death or segregation in society. And remember that the patterns of inheritance of a dominant gene are very different from the patterns of inheritance of a recessive gene. Only 2 out of all the crosses that you see, you're going to have children with these recessive traits showing up. And in dominant traits, it's going to be way more common to actually see the traits showing up regardless of the cross you're trying to do. And here you see some of those traits that we talked about throughout the lecture, and some of the patterns of dominance that they present. For example, brown eyes are dominant over gray, hazel, blue, or anything else. And gray and green and hazel are dominant to blue, so it's going to be the hardest to have the brown eyes. But blue is also dominant to the albino or the pink or color eyes. So you see how there's multiple alleles in that eye system. And being farsighted is dominant over being normal-sighted, but being normal-sighted is dominant over being nearsighted, and normal color vision is dominant to having color blindness. And you see that it's also the hair dominant is black over blonde, brunette is dominant over red hair, which is the most recessive of them all, and curly is definitely dominant to straight. So it's very rare or more difficult to have straight hair, but not necessarily rare. It depends on advantages. Remember that. Dimples are dominant over having none, so it's actually rare, which is weird, right? Roman nose is actually dominant over straight nose, but that's actually rare as well. Remember, maybe because it's not preferred. Unattached earlobes is actually dominant to attached earlobes, so it's actually interesting. Having extra digits is actually dominant to being normal digits, but see how that's actually rare, right? So remember the things we talked about. Fused digits is actually dominant over normal digits. So having normal digits is a recessive trait. So you can see, I like these things because they're showing you that a lot of the traits, dominance does not necessarily mean beneficial or necessarily more common. Short digits are dominant to normal digits. Lacking joints is dominant to normal digits, and that's the people who are double jointed, for example. Also dominant over normal digits. Being immune to poison ivy, it's dominant over not being immune, but that's actually rare. Normal coloring, it's dominance to being albino, so that's actually more common. Normal clotting is actually dominant to being homophilous, so homophilous is a recessive trait. Deafness is also recessive, and so is PKU. We talked about these things. Let's see some more. Tongue rolling is a dominant trait. Tongue fading, which it's actually a dominant inability. Having your left thumb over the right thumb is actually dominant. I'm recessive for that because I actually always put my right thumb on top. Being able to taste PTC, we're going to do that lab in class, is actually dominant. Recessive is the other way around. Having an oval face is actually dominant to having a cleft chin to having no cleft chin. Having hair on your mid-digit over no having mid-hair. Being of the Rh blood positive is dominant over the negative. Having separated eyebrows is dominant over having joined eyebrows. Having long eyelashes, dominant over short. Hitchhiker's thumb is the recessive. It's easier to, the dominant is having the straight thumb, but most people have the hitchhiker thumb. So they see dimples, again, dominant. Almond eyes are dominant over round eyes. And finally, the albinate is recessive, but dwarfism is going to be dominant. And so you see these different kinds of traits that we talked about throughout the things, and you see the patterns of dominance in all of them. And autosomal disorders are going to be things like Huntington's disease or PKU, and we talked about these already, but these are traits which are being more unlikely to happen. For example, Huntington's disease are caused by gathering too much of a certain protein gathering and destroying the basal ganglia of the brain, which will cause degeneration of brain faculties. And the PKU will be the inability of processing phenylalanine, which is one of the 20 common types of amino acids, because you lack the PAH enzyme, so that will aggregate to toxic levels and cause all problems of damage in the brain as well as other parts of the body. So Huntington's disease is an example of a dominant trait versus PKU, which is an example of recessive trait. So these are just showing you how there can be disorders which are both recessive and dominant. All right? Eye color, we talked about that. It's incomplete dominance in multiple alleles. Sickle cell anemia, incomplete dominance, depending on which layer you look at. Remember, if you look closer, it will be actually, that's one of those things that it depends on the level of that you look at. Chemically, it looks more like incomplete dominance, but if you look at molecularly, it actually looks like codominance, and if you look at the organism level, it looks like a complete dominance. We talked about that in a previous video during the Mendel lecture series. Skin color is definitely polygenetic as well. There's many genes involved with that, and so is height, and that's why you have that, instead of having that discontinuous or one versus the other look, you have many looks in between, because there are many genes which are in charge of this. So what you end up getting is an additive factor, so you're going to have a little more height if you have one more gene telling you to be tall. So typically, as it's coming from multifactorial traits or polygenic traits, you have actually an additive factor kind of thing, where your skin color is going to be determined by a combination of many genes. So that's why you have so many tones of skin color. The ABO group, again, is multiple alleles. Colorblind is a sex-linked recessive, and hemophilia, also sex-linked recessive. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, also sex-linked recessive. And so you see that there are different kinds of patterns for all of these disorders. And the next step for you as you watch this video is to ask me which disorder you're in charge of doing it, and then you're going to have to research the symptoms of that disorder, the actual type of genetic mutation that we talked about in this video series that causes those symptoms, the type of genetic relationship that is causing it, either autosomal or sex-linked, either dominant or recessive, what the mutation actually causes, which actually leads to the symptoms of the disease, so the actual biochemical or physiological causes of the disease, the epidemiology of the disease, or how that disease actually spreads in the population, where is it more common, where is it least common, things like that. How is the disease diagnosed? What's the prognosis, or what happens to people who have this disease? Is there a treatment? Is there something that can be done? If there is, what is the treatment, and things like that. You're going to have to research that for one of these disorders, and you have to tell me about it so that I can assign you one, and then you have to make a wiki space about it. When you are done creating your wiki space, you have to prepare to present this in class in a creative way, doing a 6 genes activity. There's going to be a day that we all get together in class and talk about all these disorders, and then the day after that, we're going to take a quiz on the disorder factors, which is going to focus on the most important ones of those disorders. But remember that these disorders will not be a part of the chromosome inheritance quiz. There will be no questions about any of the disorders. It will be more about all the other stuff in the lecture guide, and our quiz will focus on that rather than focusing on the actual facts about the disorders. We will do that after we have all the wiki spaces already completed up on the website for these disorders. All right? So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed learning about chromosomal inheritance. And as you can see, there are many different patterns of inheritance, many different patterns of diseases, and I hope you learned a lot. And now go out there and make your mom proud.